Michael Evans, and you're listening to America's Voice. Thanks for joining with us. We are coming back from a quick commercial break. We're in our second segment of 4. Glad to have you on board. The issues that are exploding all over our nation are really pretty frightening. But it's not just here, folks. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that what's happening to our fiscal situation and our rule of law is not limited just to the United States of America. It's happening all over the world. The media has been derelict in their duty. And, I got an email from a guy the other day, and he said, these politicians in our country, and I'm going to just jump back to the domestic United States for a moment, should be labeled dishonorably discharged. Because when you are dishonorably discharged, you are labeled in a manner and in a fashion that exposes your dishonor and your lack of integrity, your lack of trust to the world. And I can't think of a better way to remove these people from Congress. You've got an election coming up, ladies and gentlemen. Every member of the House, every member is up for re-election. From John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi and that entire upper echelon leadership crew, all the way down to these freshmen who began 2 years ago. And I got to tell you, I don't think there's more than a handful that deserve to retain their jobs. And I mean that sincerely. I think we'd be hard-pressed to find 5 that should not be dishonorably discharged. Now, the world is leading itself down a fiscal path of complete and utter devastation. Yet the other day, and I posted it up on our sites and so forth, there was an article out about how the world's debt has now exceeded $100 trillion. Folks, $100 trillion. Now, this is just in hardcore front-facing debt, right? Like ours is $17 trillion, 17.4 at this point. Now, I want you to understand something. That's the best case scenario, because when we talk about forward-facing debt and 17 trillion in our case, 100 trillion globally, recognize something. That's only the debt that the books are showing that are exposed. That doesn't count in government guarantees for banks and bailouts. That doesn't cover the derivatives crisis, which is a $300 trillion risk. And not only we, but other nations have stood behind that and said, we'll put taxpayers on the hook for that. I got to point something obvious out to you. Because when you start talking in the trillions, people just kind of lose, they lose the ability to, put it into perspective. $1 trillion is too much for any of us to really grasp and get our hands or our arms around. But when you talk about $100 trillion, you have to realize that dollar figure exceeds the asset value of the entire planet. In other words, $100 trillion is greater than the asset value of the planet. We couldn't sell ourselves to Saturn or, Mars for $100 trillion. If they were looking at Earth as an acquisition target, they would reject us because we are so far down the road of bankruptcy that it would be impossible to turn this business, if you will, around. Now, there's an article out about how the markets are holding their breath as China's shadow banking grinds to a halt. And I don't think you really understand the context of this until you understand what this article is. This is from the Telegraph in the UK. And their subtitle is fresh loans in China's shadow banking system evaporated to almost nothing from $160 billion in January. Now, the weak data that's coming back from China and Japan has led to a very, very sharp sell-off in Asian stock markets and the biggest one-day crash in iron ore prices since the Lehman crisis. Why aren't you hearing about this on the media? Why aren't you hearing about this on the news? Any news, Fox included. The Shanghai Composite Index of Stocks fell below a key level of 2,000 after investors reacted with shock to an 18% slump in Chinese exports in February. An 18% slump. And to signs that credit is wilting again. Iron ore fell 8.3% alone. Fresh loans in China's shadow banking system evaporated to almost nothing in comparison to January, where there were $160 billion. Suggesting that the clampdown on the $8 trillion sector is hard-bitten. Quote, this is Wei Yao from Societe Generale. It seems that rising default risk has started to erode Chinese investors' confidence. Together with continued regulatory tightening on banks' off-balance sheet activity, we are certain this slowing trend, a credit trend, has further to go and will inflict real pain on the economy. Now, Japan's economy is losing steam again. And here's the problem with that. Japan has never really truly recovered. And they are bracing themselves for a consumption tax that's going to rise from 5 to 8%. It's a 3% increase, on a consumption tax that is charged over there. And their economic growth has dropped from 4% in early 2013, a year ago today, to 0.7% in the fourth quarter. Now, their trade deficit is hitting record highs. China has allowed a corporate bond default that no one's talking about. And, you know, it's not just China and the yuan. Russia has seen a significant drop in the ruble because of what's going on over in the Ukraine. They spent an extraordinary $50 billion building Sochi for the Olympics. And now they're going to, for all intents and purposes, take over at least Crimea and perhaps the remainder of the Ukraine. That's not inexpensive. They stand to lose significant amounts of revenue as the gas pipelines and the oil pipelines that run through the Ukraine that all stem and begin in Russia and then exit the Ukraine to go to Eastern and Western Europe. And if they lose those oil pipelines and those natural gas pipelines, for all intents and purposes, folks, Russia's done. They're out of business. That's the only thing keeping Russia afloat. It's what's been keeping them afloat and allowing them to grow and Putin to grow in audacity and power. Now, you can't believe for a moment that they are, China and Russia are not inextricably linked to the U.S. dollar. And let's not kid ourselves. The real truth and the real numbers here, which again, and I'm going to jump back to a point I made in the first segment here about how the Obama administration has falsified the numbers of DHS and immigration to pretend as if he's really making a lot of deportations when he's really double counting. In other words, he's counting those people that they turn back at the border, which no prior president has done. But it's not limited only to that. This administration also has redone the mathematical equations to determine things like what the what the inflation rate is and other market and economy indicators, including unemployment. If you look at the real true numbers of unemployment, not just those who have been looking for a job in the last X weeks, but those who they classify as no longer existent people because they have stopped looking for a job, we are in excess of 20% unemployment. If you calculate the real true rate of inflation, because they've also changed the method by which they calculate inflation. They took energy and food out of the equation, which gives you a false sense of security because you're not hearing the real numbers. The real numbers, when you put energy and food back into the equation and you calculate it the way it's previously been calculated, we have been operating with an 11% inflation per year for the past 5. Ladies and gentlemen, you can only hide the truth for so long. The Fed, when Obama took over, had a $600 some odd billion balance sheet. They're now over $6 trillion. In other words, they were just over a half a trillion when this all began in 09, 08. And now they're over 6 trillion. People, the Fed has $6 trillion of debt that they're playing with. And they haven't actually ponied up the money to get that. That's the problem. You see, it's all smoke and mirrors. They're giving IOUs for federal IOUs, Treasury IOUs. The Treasury issues an IOU, and the Fed in turn issues another IOU and then prints money. The 17 trillion, 17.3, 17.4 by the end of the month roughly, is not even properly calculated. It already exceeds our GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the sum total of all of the production of the nation. And we're at 100% GDP or greater. Anytime, and you can ask any economist about this, unless this is an economist that's on the staff of somebody in Washington or somebody else is in favor with some other totalitarianistic government, will tell you that when you strike 100% GDP in debt, the jig's up. Now, I just did an interview with Jack Spirko, and he's with the Survival Podcast. Many of you know him. Many of you listen to his podcast daily. He's got some 80,000 people that listen and capture the Spirko Podcast and the Survival Podcast. And I'm going to, I have to write an article about it, and I'll be posting it up before the end of this week. And what we were talking about, and Jack has broken the story and the news on something that most of you aren't aware of, and you're going to be stunned when you find out what's happening. The savings accounts of Americans who are saving money through retirement plans, such as 401ks and what have you, and you have to understand the size of the retirement funds in the United States of America. That money is being funneled in a new way, and it's been a quiet little change that's been made. And if you have a 401k, I want you to go and do your homework on this. And here's what your homework is. There used to be, and this is only going back a couple of years, there used to be an option where you could take money from your 401k and put it into a cash option. Now, that's not a money market account, but it was a cash option. And you will notice if you go and look at your 401k and attempt to put money into a cash option that it is no longer there. and it is now being invested into a government securities option, which means that basically you no longer have the option to put the money into cash. It's being pumped into government treasuries. And so how this came about, you'll have to wait until you can hear the whole interview with Jack, because it's an hour-long interview. But the point is simply this. They are using Americans' retirement monies to help fund this. And they're using it in conjunction with the Fed, buying debt, monetizing our debt, which they swore up and down they would never do, but they're doing anyway. And they're now putting your money at risk, along with all of the rest of this faux money that's floating around that doesn't really even exist in the first place. You're being forced into buying treasuries even though you don't want them. And your money is not allowed to be kept in cash. Now, why did I start this with China? Because if China slips, if Japan slips, I want you to understand the implications. China is the second largest holder of our debt. Most people don't realize that. Japan is the second largest holder of our debt. China is the first. And Japan is not far behind China. China owns about $3.3 trillion, and Japan is only slightly below that. When you talk about the amount of risk that is associated with their collapse being contagious, if you will, to the United States, it's not a question, it's a fact. It's not a question of will it happen, it's a question of how bad will it strike us. So, and all the machinations and machinations and all of the shell game behind the smoke and mirrors, behind the scenes games that the Fed play won't do any good. Now, China last week allowed a solar company to default on their bonds. And this is the first ever failure in their domestic bond market. And here's the problem. When you start seeing them allow their own bond market and corporate bond market to default, that is a very, very dangerous sign. China's credit market was in a boom for a long, long time. And now the bubble is literally beginning to disintegrate in front of our eyes. China alone accounts for half of the 30 trillion increase in world debt over the past 5 years alone. Did you hear what I just said? China accounts for half of the $30 trillion increase in world debt over the past 5 years. Now, knowing that I just said to you when we began this that the international global governmental debt is now $100 trillion, has struck the $100 trillion market, and knowing that just in the last 5 years it has increased by 30 trillion, ought to have the hair on the back of your neck standing straight out. Folks, last year alone, between the United States and Europe, China invested $5 trillion alone. Just in those two. And I got to tell you, this cannot sustain. When your assets exceed, when your debts exceed your assets, you can no longer pretend that there is a viable alternative or a viable solution to overcome that. You can't buy your way out of it. You can't float your way out of it. You can't double count your way out of it. And recognize that when we talk about $100 trillion as the global debt, we're not even accounting for the fact that a lot of that is due to double counting. In other words, it's much higher than $100 trillion. What I am going to tell you is this. If you have not taken the time to seriously evaluate the preparations that you should be looking at for, if nothing else, just the feeding of your own family in a short-term, mid-term, or long-term crisis, then I cannot encourage you strongly enough to begin that process now. I don't know when you're going to need it, but I know one thing. You are going to need it. We have a program that Battery Station has put together for America's Voice Now listeners, and I want you to participate in it because we don't make a dime on it. America's Voice Now doesn't make a penny on it, and Battery Station doesn't make a penny on it. In fact, it costs them money to do this for you. But they've graciously agreed to put this effort together to allow our own community, and this is, of course, a program that's really geared for locals, so if you're listening across the country, find an alternative solution similar to this in your community. But the Battery Station allows you to participate in our America's Voice Now radio co-op. So basically, you go down to the Battery Station, which is located on Washington Avenue, 303 Washington Avenue, and you ask to see the co-op catalog. And basically, you're buying bulk food at wholesale. Bulk food at wholesale. This is what the retail stores buy it for and then resell it to you at a profit. And right off the bat, you're going to save 30 to 50% over what your normal food bill would be. 30 to 50%, folks. Now, this is dry goods. There's no, this is nothing for the freezer or anything along those lines. This is just, bags of grain, bags of rice, bags of corn, wheat, flour, sugar, salt, the basics. But I got to tell you something. That's the kind of thing that you're going to find in very, very short supply. Just going to throw a little tidbit out to you that'll ought to shock you. The Ukraine, which we're all hearing about, is considered and has long been considered to be what's called the breadbasket of Eastern Europe and Russia. And they produce the grain that feeds Russia, period. End of argument. The Ukraine, geographically, is probably not much bigger than about Texas. And the Ukraine, last year, produced more grain and more foodstuffs solely and individually than the United States of America produced collectively. People, if that doesn't scare the heck out of you, nothing should. We're paying, through a farm bill of $1 trillion, half of which is borrowed, we're paying our farmers not to grow. Help me grasp the insanity of that. What would be the purpose of that? Other than an intentional, willful, manipulative intent to break the back, the economic, the financial, and the food value back of the United States of America. Let me tell you something. When you're hungry, you'll do anything and everything that you're told. When your little girl steps up to you and says, "Mommy, I'm really hungry, Mommy. I haven't eaten in 2 days." And your little boy walks up and says, Daddy, I can't. Daddy, I'm so hungry. I haven't eaten anything in 3 days. Daddy, what are we going to do? You will do whatever they tell you to do. You've been listening to America's Voice. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the CIA versus the Senate Oversight Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see the thriller in Manila, this is it. We're talking about a serious, serious constitutional crisis here. And it's bleeding over. This is a level of rogue agency treason we've never seen in the United States of America. You're listening to America's Voice. Stick with us. We'll be right back.